Yes.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Yaakov Glasser. Rabbi Glasser is the rabbi of the Young Israel of Clifton Passaic. And the reason that I asked him to come on is because I was involved in some small way when a convicted sex offender moved into his community. And I am a very firm believer that leadership matters and that the things that we do in our communities really do make a difference. And I was just so extraordinarily impressed with the way Rabbi Glasser handled things. I thought you should hear it from him directly because I think there's a real takeaway lesson from this. Rabbi Glasser, welcome and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's an honor to be in this discussion with you. I'm humbled that you're even impressed at something I did. You are, without a question, the role model and the gold standard and the consultant. And also, we blame everything on you.
Yeah,
in
you get
this
plenty of that too, I'm
in
sure.
this entire domain, and it's an honor to be talking to you, and we're blessed to have people in the community who have devoted their lives to focusing on these kinds of issues. It's saved a lot of lives. It's saved a lot of pain. It addresses things properly when things have to happen, and we've all grown from that. And Rabbi Horowitz is a very talented man, and he could be doing many, many, many different things with his time. And the fact that he spends so much time for our community focusing in this space, I'm sure is not what his original ambition was when he was preparing
That,
for his career. And
that
we're
is
we're
correct.
blessed. We're blessed.
That certainly is correct.
We're blessed. We're blessed. You know.
Yes. So again, thank you very much. So tell me, what was it like, and how did I only know when you called me to ask me to get bring you some books and come down to
Sure.
shul. But
Yeah.
what's the
Sure.
backstory, and what are real of the takeaway lessons for
Sure.
the
Sure.
community leaders and parents who are listening?
So the first thing that everyone needs to understand is that unfortunately these things happen. They happen everywhere. And if you are a Rav in a community and you've been a Rav for long enough, you will encounter, sometimes sooner in your career, sometimes a little bit later in your career, you will encounter this issue, not just as an issue that's distant to your life that you have to be sensitive to, like, it's not necessarily something that's directly impacting your community, like we had in an extraordinary way recently, and you have to address and lead your community and how to relate to things like that, like the Chaim Walder situation. But it'll hit home. It will. Statistically speaking, it'll happen. And what was unique about this situation is that originally an individual had moved into the area about whom there were accusations. And those accusations, with the help of not just myself, other Rabbanim as well, those accusations were actually brought to the police. The individual was convicted of these crimes, and they were incarcerated for a period of years. And it was out of sight, out of mind. They were in prison for a lot of years. And then one day, prison terms end. And it's hard to understand sometimes how our criminal justice system handles different types of crimes. But the prison term was, frankly, shorter than I had imagined it would be. But as often happens with these things, I don't have to tell you, Rabbi Horowitz, often because it involves children and because it's hard to get testimony from children, often these situations do not have as long of a run as one would expect. And so the individual completed his prison term and chose to move back to the community, which was shocking to everyone because, people here were, there was another community where he lived beforehand that was not as hostile to his presence and did not take proactive measures to ensure that he was accountable for his actions. But we were, so we were kind of surprised, but he had nothing. He had no family anymore, and he had a property that belonged to a relative of his that he had access to, and so he moved back into the community. And it was complicated because this is well beyond the question of what do you report, when do you report, to whom do you report, which obviously myself and my colleagues feel strongly you report whenever there's a chashash that somebody could be engaged in behavior that's compromising to the safety and well-being of children. And we did, but this was a completely different question. This person had served out his time. They were indicated on lists. I think it's called, is it called Megan's List? That's correct, right?
Registry, sex offender
Registry,
registry,
sex offender
whatever.
registry. So
Yeah.
he was on the registry, but there was no reporting. There was no, you can't call up the police and say this man is living here. This man has a right to
Absolutely.
live where he chooses to live.
Yeah.
And there are actually a lot of laws that protect the well-being of the individual.
Right.
You have to be very careful about getting up and saying anything that could be construed as instructing people to take sort of like vigilante, independent measures, to be hostile to him. That could result in tremendous legal ramifications for yourself. So there are actually laws to protect these people. And so we were faced with a very big challenge because on one hand, I was pretty confident after talking with many psychologists and people who I respect, I was pretty confident that this individual, based on this criminal justice experience, was not necessarily cured of these impulses. So we had we had the same level of vigilance that was needed to protect our community. On the other hand, the individual was there, and expelling him from the community was not necessarily a legal option. Before we go on, I should say he does no longer live here. He does no longer live here. I believe he lives in Eretz Yisrael. And I believe the communities
Good.
there and Rabbanim there are aware,
Oh,
of his past,
good. Good.
but he no longer lives here. But he did, and it actually started with a confrontation in the shul, because our shul is nearby to where he had lived, and so he attended a mariv on Motzei Shabbos, and I'm sitting literally. My seat faces the tzibur, and I'm sitting there, and I start mariv. You say Baruch Hu facing the wall, and then you kind of turn around, and before you kind of focus yourself inward on your tefillah, you
Yeah.
kind of, I don't know, your eyes just scan the room, how many people are here, I don't know, it's impulse. It's maybe I was a bigger tzaddik. I wouldn't even see the room between Baruch Hu and
Yeah.
the brachas. But the bottom line is, it caught my eye. This individual caught my eye, and I said to myself, "Oh my gosh, that it's this guy." So we have, one of the things we did, and this gets into the practicality of all of this, is it is incredibly important to have policies in your institutions. When you try to deal with these things reactive to the situation as it presents itself, so then you're always kind of you're always doing so in a context that creates sort of a direct confrontation between yourself and the individual. When there are institutional policies in place and you're implementing those policies, what that accomplishes is, first of all, it's a statement of values of the institution. And that's important because that itself is an educational of value to the community. But more importantly, when you're forced, or when you're in a situation where you have to take action, you're not taking action as a result of a certain, like a personal animosity towards an individual. This is the policy of our shul. This is what it is. The policy of our shul is that we do not allow people who are convicted sex offenders. This is a private institution. We have a lot of children around. We do not allow them to daven in this shul.
And you had
So
that, Lassa, just to be clear, you had this well before he came into the picture.
yeah.
And that was just like, I'm just curious, I don't want to take too much time on this, but what was the process that you developed? Did you take it from a different
Yeah, I
show?
wish I could describe this like very, very sophisticated institutional. It involved a few board members and myself kind of coming together and saying, we need to have these policies in place. I'm sure this is a mid-sized shul, I would call it. I'm sure in larger shuls, this has been flushed out more with attorneys and, my colleague. I also work at Yeshiva University. I'm a dean at Yeshiva University, And my colleague Avi Lauer, who was the president of the Young Israel of Woodmere.
With me. He wrote the
Israel of Woodmere
protocol.
is like a small country. My shul is a little village. So in Young Israel of Woodmere, I know that he worked hard on like
Right?
very, very robust policies, and that's good. That's very important. So anyway, I simply walked up to him in the middle of davening. I hadn't started my brachas, and people were around, and I tried to do it without any, I don't need to make a scene. I sat down next to him, and he's not stupid. He knows that there's a history with the community, and I said to him, I'm sorry, you can't daven here. And he said to me, He didn't want. I guess he didn't want to be mafsik, in the middle of
You don't want
his.
to interrupt his prayers, his tefillas.
So I said, I'm sorry, I said, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to, you don't have to say anything, but you have to step out. You know what I mean? So again, it was, and then finally, I was like, look, I also don't want to interrupt my tefillas, and eventually he left. But what we were left with, I didn't consider that a victory. What we were left with was what troubled the families living in the area, specifically in the immediate area of the shul, is that this individual, there's no way to track them. There's no supervision. There's no system in place and they were worried. They have children. They play in the backyard. They go to the pizza shop. There was a pizza shop down the block. They ride their bikes, and they were terrified that this individual was living like amongst them. And I started to meet with them, and they started to come to me, and we started to talk, and so much so that like parents wouldn't let their children play in the backyard. Parents wouldn't let their children, walk down the street. Now, the reality is we were not dealing with a violent, we were not dealing with the type of individual that was likely to like go invading your backyard. But because no one had any tools, and no one had any education, and no one had any ability to address the situation for what it was, and because it relates to people's children, which is obviously their most precious, element of their life, so people just felt totally paralyzed. Like there was nothing they could do. There was nowhere they could go, and they shut down. And it was not healthy. It was not healthy. And that's the point where. I also want to just say I had some amazing lay leaders. This was not just the rabbi at all. I had some amazing lay leaders who were involved in this whole process. People with tremendous sensitivity to this. And rabbis should not take this stuff on their own, ever. This is something that you want to, somebody you trust, somebody you know that's sensitive to these issues. You want to share, there are different roles to play, in the leadership dynamic in dealing with a situation like this. Some of them are more appropriate for the rabbi, and some of them are more appropriate for the lay leadership of the shul, who have accountability for the institution and play an important role in the community. So we came together and we basically decided like we needed to create some sort of mahalach for people to be able to be vigilant, to be able to protect their children, but also not to feel totally, threatened all the time. And that's when I reached out to Rabbi Horowitz, who came, and it was actually pretty amazing. We had in the social hall of our shul, we invited, it wasn't just our members, we invited anyone who lived in these few blocks, in this area, and chaver de isla, everybody shared. And we all sat in a circle. It was very social worky, which
Exactly.
some
That's
people did
exactly
well
how
with.
I remember it. I was telling
Yeah,
my wife Woody before when I said I'd like to interview. I said I still remember the meeting. I remember that everybody was sitting in a circle.
yeah. That came because I was the regional director of NCSY for many years.
Okay,
So
that's okay. You didn't have to
anything meaningful in life that needs to be conveyed to a group of people
goes in a
ultimately
circle.
needs to be done in a circle. Exactly.
So
So
it was, by the way, messaging is so important, just like the messaging to offenders is, and the message to the rest of the communities. But the messaging there was that this is not, I'm not bringing in some guy to lecture
exactly.
to you. I want to hear what you have to say. And I was stunned when I walked in. I thought it was amazing. I mean, I remember that it was inside, I can't find my car keys most of the time,
Right.
I remember clearly how you had them sitting around in an oval.
So everybody was sitting around, and I think we also had some of our local, some representation from our local mental health
Yeah, I think
agency.
Federation, I think
Um,
so, somebody.
right, exactly, because that was an important partnership. I felt that Rabbi
Sure, absolutely.
Horowitz could
Yep.
contribute some expertise, and but it's also important to have the local partnerships are important too. So, and it was a tough conversation. It was a tough conversation because what Rabbi Horowitz had to do was help people feel, number one, more empowered and more in control of their safety and their children's safety, and not to feel like they're already victims of something that didn't even happen, you know? And that was, I think, step one, just that people, and even just the gathering, I think helped with shifting that mindset that, like, we're not just at the whims of this circumstance. There's what we could do to improve on the conditions of the circumstance or relate to it or deal with it. And then the second piece was really to try to give people a sense of, what were reasonable precautions that need to be taken, and what were not. But what really, the third piece that really came out of this was, and this is important independent of this circumstance, and this I think really guides my general and our general hashkafa towards this issue altogether, and that is that the single greatest way to prevent anything from happening to a child is not to follow around a convicted child molester all day and know where they are. The single greatest thing that will prevent harm to a child is to empower the child to be able to do something about a situation that they can already detect has elements to it that are off and that are uncomfortable. And obviously connected to that is to make sure that your children are only in environments where other people are also, sensitive to that reality. So that's really where we kind of went at the end, which is, like what could we tell our children to make sure that if they did, God forbid, come within 20 feet of this individual, that, that they're not going to allow. And that's where Rabbi Horowitz's book came in very helpful, because it helped
You purchased a
facilitate.
book for every family, I believe, right?
Yeah,
Or the
yeah,
Federation did
yeah,
or whatever. Yeah. I
yeah,
remember
yeah, and it
I
helped.
remember schlepping in a bunch of books.
Yeah, yeah. And look, in our home, we're very makpid on this. My wife's a psychologist and a child psychologist, and our children, if I would bring any of them in here, um, in the month of June when they're getting ready to go to camp, at this point,
They get
all
the
we have to do is say the word. Now, guys, as soon as we say one word, they'll be like, "We know, we know, we know. No one can touch us, and if we're uncomfortable, we tell an adult." Like, this script has been ingrained in them since they were
good for
very
you.
little, and we don't do it in a scary way. We do it in a thoughtful way,
Also, right?
and that's important. And I want to say that every year before camp starts, I get up in shul, and I've gotten a little bit of pushback for this, because I don't do it just in front of the adults. I do it in front of whoever's in shul. So children hear the announcement also. I get up in front of.
That's good.
I think it's good. I think it's good. But listen, I respect the fact that many parents feel that they want sensitive issues to
Right.
be presented to their children in the way that they want to retain control over that. And I don't think I understand that, but I'll tell you what I do think is good is we're forcing the conversation.
Right.
So we're
Right.
forcing the conversation. And I get up for camp, like in the first or second week of June, and I share with the shul two messages. Number one is it's your responsibility as a parent to know what the level of training, oversight, and general approach to these types of issues are in the camps that you're sending your children to. You do not get to have something happen at camp and then find out that there were no policies and no trainings in place, and then start screaming and yelling about the Jewish people and the Jewish community in the camps. I mean, you could, but the bottom line is that, you by that point the damage is done. Your job as a parent is to take responsibilities, take achrayas for your children. And Baruch Hashem, I have to say, as you know, when I started doing this, parents would ask, and there was less training over the years. It's become much more prevalent, and I do believe the community's come a long way in that regard. So that's one thing, and then the other thing is to have a conversation with your children about what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what they should do if they feel uncomfortable, that no one's allowed to do certain things. You know, all these different pieces that I'm sure have been reviewed in these forums. And I remind everyone that this is the time of year to have such a conversation. You know, I'm a big believer that the mitzvah of chinuch is primarily and fundamentally on the parent. And it's just that we can't do everything. It's really my job. I mean, it really is. I can't do everything. I can't teach my children everything they need to know. I'm not qualified. I don't have time. They need to be in a socializing atmosphere. So we send them to schools, and we send them to camps, and these are incredibly important experiences. I'm a big camp person. People in my shul would say I'm too much of a camp person. I was the head counselor of a camp for a long time. I oh, camp was the best, you know. So I recognize what it gives, but at the end of the day, you know, these things are our achrayas. These things are our responsibility. We don't delegate. You know, we partner with these entities in the education of our children. And the difference between abdicating our responsibility to them and partnering with them is whether or not we still feel like we retain some sense of achrayas on what's going on. And that's what I try to convey, you know, that we're achray, you know. Now, sometimes you do everything you can do and something terrible happens. Okay? We know that that's true in life in general. You know, sometimes you take care of your health perfectly and something terrible happens, you know. Sometimes you drive perfectly and the actions of someone else, you know, hurt somebody. And sometimes you can educate everybody perfectly and still something terrible could go through. But we know that statistically speaking, the vulnerability factor drops exponentially when people have education and language, which is very important. You know, to have the language to say, you know, what it is. And that's I think so. I think that's what we really learned from that situation. What we learned from it was that ultimately, if our goal of keeping our children safe is to control all the abusers, then we're never going to accomplish that goal, because that's not the nature of the world. You can't possibly be on top of all of those things. You have to be on top of it as much as you can, as much as you possibly can. But
things. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go.
Yeah, no. But the education and the knowledge and the, you know, to me, like that was really one of the main takeaways.
And if I remember correctly, because this is my practice, when I'm called into a situation that's tense, you know, rather than just do some training before the summer, but a situation like in yours when there is a sex offender there already and everybody's just understandably terrified. What I usually do in a very calm voice, so you said they should not to scare them. The research shows that when you frighten children, when you do child safety education, the fear crowds the mind. They can't remember anything. Dr. David Pelkowitz told me that. But back when I was first starting in this space, he says, tell parents to be calm 2 or 3 out of 10. That's what he said. Enough to know that it's important, but not to bug them out because they get overwhelmed and they can't remember what you said. But what I usually tell parents, I'm almost certain that I think I remember saying it to your folks, is that every single community has abusers. Now, if you run the math, if you have a community of 200, 300, 400 families, there's at least one abuser there. It's sad to say, but that's the way it is. I said, don't focus only on that person. I did the same thing with Yonah Weinberg and Harnof. The same thing. They expected me to come in and talk all about him. I said, look, he's here. We know it. It's an issue to deal with. But I said, if your community does this right now, my feeling is that you'll be safer than other communities because you took the steps and you have the mindset that everybody should have. it's creepy to think that there are sex offenders walking around everywhere. But child safety education is meant to to protect them from that. So
100%.
exactly what you said. Not to make it about them, but rather something the community. One more thing, we had on. I interviewed Dr. Michael J. Solomon, who's a fantastic therapist, a researcher. He worked with Avi Lauer on the Young Israel. He made the protocols together with Avi Lauer in Young Israel of Woodmere. And I asked him to explain the grooming process, and I really was the fact that abusers groom communities also. It's called institutional grooming. It's a thing. So he said, I never heard it expressed this way. He said that there's an inverse pyramid, that when abusers start, the first thing they do is they try to ingratiate themselves in the whole community so that people know them and that people get comfortable with them. And then only then do they start with the extended family and then the parents and then God forbid the child. So this statement that you make by saying a sex offender is not welcome, and by the protocols and putting it in your constitution, in your paperwork, that you're going to stand up for children, I believe sex offenders don't move there in the first place, or leave shortly thereafter, because they see that this is the case. And one of the things I'm trying to do with this series of classes is to really get this front and center in parents' minds, that the decisions that we make as parents and as community leaders really make a difference. I walked into a shul in my hometown of Monsey about 15 years ago. I decided the kids were away for Shabbos and my wife was at friends. I had about 2 free hours. I walked around the shuls, and one of the shuls I walked into had a registered sex offender sitting during Shalosh Shidduchos. And I said to myself, my goodness, what a message that shul is sending by just letting this happen. So, that's the opposite extreme. Rabbi
What's
Glasser, thank you
interesting
so much
about
for sharing. I'm
what you said
sorry?
about the pyramid is very interesting, because in that way, the strength of our community is also a little bit of a weakness, because first of all, we're a very trusting community.
Right.
I mean, and second of all, there are so many entry points for someone to ingratiate themselves
Totally. Right.
to a community. I mean, if you move into a community and you're part of like the non-Jewish, community, so what are you going to do? You're going to like convene a
Right.
block party where you're going to tell everybody that you're a really good
Exactly.
guy and start giving out
Exactly.
candy?
Exactly.
Like what are you going to do? So you're like a creepy guy who like roams parks. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like
Exactly.
you're
Right.
already looking like a little
Right.
off.
Right.
But by us, like you can move
So
in.
you
And
got
within 6 months, you could be sponsoring Kiddush and giving a
exactly.
daf and,
Get
like it's
invited to people's homes for
getting
Shabbos.
invited to people's home. That doesn't happen in a normal,
Right.
environment. So, number one is, that's part of the reason why we have to embrace the model of
Yeah.
education so strongly,
Yeah.
because we
And you
don't want to lose the
right.
trusting element
Right.
of our
Right.
community. And
But kadei v'chashtei, we should be
exactly.
respect and trust and verify. And I asked Dr. Solomon, I always ask clinicians and people I talk to for book recommendations. So I just asked him so he recommended a book that someone wrote about the church, about the impact of child sexual abuse on churches and how the risk factors. And it's stunning. I mean, we're small communities, underfunded institutions, and they
Right.
wrote about how the church is meant to be a trusting place. And I actually saw some research on the theory of the just world hypothesis, that we want to believe we live in a fair place. So the research shows that it's more pronounced by people of faith, because we believe that there's din v'dayan, that there's an accounting, a moral accounting for what goes on. So it's so much more difficult for us to get our hands around the fact that there are abusers around that could do horrible things to people. Rabbi Glasser, I am so grateful for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope to publish findings in in a week or so to best practices. And I'm creating an assessment tool. Did I mention this to you? I don't know if I did.
For communities, is that what you?
Yeah, yeah. I did an assessment tool in about 20 years ago. It was actually 2003. I felt a lot of families were sending children to Israel too lightly, especially kids who weren't making it. There was awareness about teens at risk. And everybody had someone, friend of theirs, a child who went to Israel with great difficulty and came back with their tzitzis out, so they were sending kids. And it made me crazy. So I went around screaming, begging, writing, yelling, lecturing, please don't do this. Not every kid's ready. And I realized that I'm asking them to trust me. I'm basically saying, look, trust Yankee Horowitz. I've been around the block a few times. Trust me. And I realized I'm not giving them tools. So I wrote up an assessment sheet. I'll send it to you. I'll email it to you when I hang up. I wrote an assessment sheet saying, um, my child is the age 21, 20, so 21 was 0 points. The lower
Right.
the younger they were, the more points it was. A serious student versus, and it was just right there. And it was an assessment tool. And all of a sudden, I started getting, great messaging from parents that it was working. So I want to create the same thing, best practices and an assessment, how you as a parent can look around your community.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. Look, I in the world, especially the world we live in, which is so metrics driven, and everything has to be measured and calculated and demonstrative and concrete. There's no way to capture the impact of prevention. So, the work of making sure that people aren't hurt, it's like staying healthy. It's like, like there's no way to really know. You could calculate what it's like to heal, and you can measure that, but and you can measure based on, like, God forbid, when something happens, how people react to it. But the preventative, efforts, which are at the end of the day by far the most necessary and the most important, we have no way of knowing. We have no way of knowing how many hundreds of thousands of children were not put in a compromising situation because of conversations like these. So
So
that's why we need chizuk. That's why we need chizuk. That's why I get up
but
every year.
listen to the hook. Listen to the hook. I was thinking of how I would present this with prevention factored in. I I'm not kidding you. Years I've been thinking of how to convey this in a way that I don't say, well, Glasser shul, Rabbi Glasser shul is low risk, and this shul is a high risk. So here's the deal. You have imagined that health insurance is, Aetna decides to offer parents a rider for child abuse treatment. God forbid if a kid was abused. So by giving X number of dollars a year, you have a policy that the parent can get free treatment and, God forbid, rehab for the rest of their life. Aetna is going to cover the cost of a child getting abused. I said, and someone comes in, an actuary, to assess risk. What questions is he going to ask?
Right.
And some of those are going to be prevention.
Right. Right.
That
You get a
that
life
was
insurance policy. Are you a
that was
smoker?
my finish.
Right.
Exactly. Same thing.
Right.
So how would somebody with a bit of knowledge, who doesn't know our community, who doesn't know Catholic communities or general population, just doesn't know anything about anything, all he or she understands is that I'm assessing what the risk of someone getting harmed here is. So are you doing training? I have it. Are you doing training? Do you have protocols in the schools? I have a whole list of things that I would write, but I want them to do it. I want to give, that's what I hope will emerge from this, is a tool that parents can look at and not to criticize, but rather to be empowered to do something about it.
Yeah. I will say that one of the things I have discovered, I want to say too much about this because, like I said, I don't have the largest shul in the world, so I don't want anybody to. But through speaking about this publicly, I've also been approached by people who are adults who were victims of this when they were children. and just there is no hasaga of the long-term impact of this, and you know, they've thanked me for doing it, but they've also told me that it's hard. It's hard. They try to get through the day with this not on their mind, and shul is and davening and learning is a little bit of an oasis
Yep.
from that pain. And here's the rabbi up there, like bringing the whole thing up
Talking
again.
about
But
it again.
but they know that it's the right thing to do. But I've had some
Okay.
interesting conversations, and that's the other thing I've learned, which is that different people react to this in different ways, and I've learned to appreciate that also. Um, you know, part of when we have something that we need to get through the Jewish community, and we're kind of banging on the issue, so sometimes we forget that like people are different. Shem made everybody different.
Yep.
People think differently. They have different emotional profiles. They've had different life
Life
experiences.
experiences, right?
Yeah, and for some, sitting in a circle and talking it through is exactly what they need. And for some, it's a picture book, and for some, it's a sheer online that they could listen to anonymously, and for some, it's a friend going over to them and saying, I noticed, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like different
Yep.
people, and that's important because if you really want to make an impact and not just wave a flag, then in these issues, then you have to do what works and not just what looks like like it's out there. And that I've also kind of come to appreciate. So
Rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov, thank you so very much. This was really delightful. So even the subject wasn't delightful, but it was really great spending time with you. Thank you so very much. Hatzlach in your work in Yeshiva University and in your shul.
thank
And
you, thank you.
it's
My
really
apologies to all your listeners. I know it's supposed to be Instagram and it's Facebook instead, and I know that's a tremendous yerida in the
you said it.
modality of
You
connection,
just
and
said that we
now
should
it's
have
a Zoom on Facebook, which is an even further yerida. And I know it's very, very. It's all me. Shouldn't think it's Rabbi Horowitz. If you ever have an entertaining section of these shiurim, if anybody recorded Rabbi Horowitz trying to teach me how to get onto an Instagram live, a process that we devoted 45 minutes to this morning and was unsuccessful, you'd appreciate the world. So
next time
Ezra Hashem, next time we're
we have a
together,
5-year-old.
exactly. Next time we're together, you'll be
Thank you so
I'll
very
have
much.
grown. Take care. Bye
You
bye.
be well.